I set up this foundation so that I could pursue causes that I could still have an impact on as a private citizen. So I picked the things that I cared about, and I could do things that were quite important that governments normally don't do. You take any nation, you will find that intelligence and ability, aspiration, they're all evenly distributed across the society, but organization, investment, and opportunity are not. When you get into this business, you have to recognize that a certain amount of humility is in order. Even governments with all their resources often fail to effect social change. So we're there to restore, if you will, the connection between people's efforts and actions and positive consequences. You can't possibly do that kind of work unless you do it with other people.
Muy buenas tardes y bienvenidos al Conservatorio de Música de Puerto Rico. En ocasión a la conferencia a ser ofrecida por el presidente Bill Clinton, fundador del Clinton Foundation. En la tarde de hoy, por deferencia al presidente Clinton, vamos a estar dirigiéndonos a ustedes en inglés y en español, así que vamos a continuar en inglés en este momento. Quiero recordarles que por favor pongan sus celulares o otros aparatos electrónicos en el modo de silencio o vibración. Muchísimas gracias. Well, good afternoon. On behalf of the government of the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, we would like to thank you for coming here today to the Conservatorio de Música de Puerto Rico in occasion of the address on energy initiatives offered by President Bill Clinton, founder of the Clinton Foundation. We are here to learn about responsible and necessary perspectives on energetic initiatives, public policies, and other topics related to our sustainable development. In times of global warming, we now know that the only effective solution to face this threat is the one capable of integrating the community input, expert advice, and political will to address what is best for our countries and for our planet as well. An energy ethic is needed to guide the development of a new energy policy for Puerto Rico. It's a complex agenda, but we are sure that we have here in this room what it takes to start this job. To begin the dialogue, please welcome the Governor of Puerto Rico, Honorable Alejandro García Padilla.
Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias a todos y a todas. Quiero saludar desde aquí a los amigos presentes, alcaldes, compañeros de la Asamblea Legislativa, exgobernadores, señor comisionado, señor exgobernador, a todos y a todas, jueces presentes, miembros del gabinete, amigos y amigas. We are deeply honored in welcoming President Clinton to Puerto Rico. The Conservatorio de Música de Puerto Rico hosting today is but one example of the many Puerto Rican institutions dedicated to creativity and human understanding. That was the vision of its founder, el maestro Pablo Casals. That was the vision of the Puerto Rican leadership that made it possible. That is still the vision of the people of Puerto Rico who welcomes you today. President Clinton is a global figure, not only because he is recognized all around the planet. His stature as a world leader stems from the global scope of his ideas, the causes he embraces, and the solution he pursues. For President Clinton, no local, regional, or national key issue can be seen and handled in isolation without global consideration and responsibilities. Los temas globales demandan conversaciones como esta que vamos a tener hoy aquí. Somos una isla, pero los insularismos mentales, o peor, los de la voluntad, no tienen lugar en el mundo interconectado que vivimos. Dos de los problemas más apremiantes del mundo son el cambio climático y las necesidades de fuentes sustentables de energía. Actuar sobre ambos problemas es condición para la sustentabilidad del planeta, pero también para alcanzar un desarrollo integral, seguro y sostenido que mitigue las desigualdades. Se trata, al fin y al cabo, de vías para fortalecer el derecho humano a una vida digna y plena. Durante los primeros meses de mi administración quise enfrentar ese reto. Adopté la más amplia política pública ambiental y energética de la historia de Puerto Rico. Atiende la conservación de nuestros recursos naturales, la protección de terrenos y cuencas hidrográficas y la demanda por una producción energética limpia, costo eficiente y que adelante el crecimiento económico. La agenda de rehabilitación económica y social del país se realiza en armonía con la conservación y la protección del ambiente. Es moralmente imperativo y es socialmente responsable. Me satisface que esa agenda sea producto de una conversación extendida entre las comunidades, los grupos ambientales, los grupos profesionales, los empresarios, los funcionarios públicos, los científicos, los académicos, muchos de los cuales están aquí hoy con nosotros. Las acciones tomadas en el corredor ecológico del noreste, o el bosque modelo, o el cañón Martín Peña son muestra de ello. Somos todos conscientes de que esta agenda requiere una transformación profunda en la manera en que producimos, gestionamos, distribuimos y consumimos energía. Si la política energética que sostuvo la modernización industrial de Puerto Rico fue el llevar electrificación hasta el último de los rincones de esta isla, hoy el propósito público es un sistema de energía sustentable para el país. Lograr la autonomía energética es factible en nuestro tiempo, pero requiere compromiso y consensos y exige modificación en la cultura del gobierno y en la cultura de la gente. La meta sigue siendo reducir la dependencia de Puerto Rico en el petróleo para generación de energía de 69% que es hoy a 40% en 5 años. Esa es la meta, esa fue la promesa. La gasificación de las plantas de la Autoridad de Energía es necesaria y en la costa sur es ahora prioridad. Me place indicarles en el día de hoy que para el 2015 alcanzaremos 50% de producción con gas natural y para el 2017, antes de lo prometido, será de 70% sin gasoductos y más rápido de lo prometido. Puerto Rico asume un papel como un socio activo en el proyecto de energía renovable que propulsa la fundación del presidente Clinton y en las políticas energéticas del gobierno federal. Me place informarles también que en las últimas 2 semanas hemos otorgado permisos para la construcción de sistemas de generación de energía solar por 100 megavatios, de los cuales 60 megavatios se otorgaron en permisos en el día de hoy. Desde la colaboración con la Fundación Clinton, desde la Universidad de Puerto Rico, desde la aplicación de políticas públicas de sustentabilidad y diversificación energética renovable, Puerto Rico será un ejemplo de responsabilidad ambiental para el resto del mundo. Con el esfuerzo de todos los compatriotas lo vamos a lograr. As another Clinton, Hillary, once said, "It takes a village to educate and nurture a child, a global village, I may add. I want to welcome President Clinton to one part of that global village, eager to hear your voice in one of the most pressing issues of our time. I'd have the great honor to introduce you, President Bill Clinton. Bienvenido, señor presidente. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Governor. Thank you for the introduction and for the announcements. Resident Commissioner, you former Governor and my longtime friend, thank you all for being here and all the officials. It is my understanding that after I speak, we're going to have a little roundtable discussion in which more specific questions will be raised and discussed. So I will try to speak not very long, because I find that when you're answering questions, at least you're talking about something the audience is interested in, even if they don't like your answers. But let me begin by saying how honored I am to be back in Puerto Rico. I love it here. Puerto Rico has been very good to me and to my wife, and for that we are both grateful. And I have enjoyed having the opportunity to work here on energy issues. In the past, when our climate change project helped with the retrofit of Las Molinas Government Complex, and did some demonstration work with LED street lights, putting new chillers in buildings and with solar panels. I wanted to try to start this discussion by putting the issues before you in the context of the economic challenges facing the world, as well as the climate change challenges facing the world. Essentially, all over the world today, the great challenges facing people normally can fall into three categories. There is too much economic inequality because of a shortage of jobs, that earn good incomes, and unequal access to education, health care, and capital. If you look at the challenges in Egypt, for example, every year the Egyptian university system produces 400,000 graduates, and the Egyptian economy produces nowhere near 400,000 jobs for those graduates. In the United States today, we find that people who finish colleges on the mainland have an unemployment rate still much lower than those who do not have university degrees, but increasingly they are being put into jobs which are, relative to what they could expect 10 years ago, lower paying. So there is a global economic challenge. There is a global challenge of stability because of the forces of interdependence which are negative. Look how fast the financial crisis spread from the United States to England, to Ireland, to tiny Iceland. For a period of time, China lost 35 million manufacturing jobs because their products could no longer be bought by the United States and Europe. Look at the problems caused by political instability around the world. Look at the controversy over whether cybersecurity has become so weak that the computer networks of countries all around the world could be crashed, with enormous implications for their banking systems as well as their national security systems. So a certain amount of instability in the world is necessary for any kind of market economy and free society to operate, but if there's too much, it can shut the system down. A certain amount of economic inequality is necessary in a market economy to reward talent and new ideas and extreme skills, but if there is too much, it is a severe constraint on economic growth. The third problem the world faces is climate change, the fact that the way we produce and consume energy cannot be maintained without severe adverse consequences. We've had 12 of the 13 hottest years ever recorded in this new century of ours. The people who deny climate change said, oh yes, but the rate of warming is slowing down. That is almost certainly because of two factors. One is the El Nino in the late 1990s, which tended to interrupt the warmth of surface temperatures by absorbing more in the water and more in the upper atmosphere. And second is high levels of pollution in China and elsewhere, which tends to artificially cool it as they begin to clean up, as they will have to save their children from asthma and other problems, and to make their cities more habitable. And we move further away from the El Nino, which was unusually strong. The process will resume. There is no question that the climate is changing at an unsustainable rate. You should care a great deal about that in Puerto Rico because there are lots of models showing that the most vulnerable places in the world are the islands because of rising sea levels. Mayor Bloomberg in New York City just proposed a huge multi-billion-dollar project to try to erect barriers to rising sea levels in the lowest lying areas of New York City. Otherwise, we could lose 50 feet of Manhattan Island between now and 2050. My office, by the way, is in Manhattan, but it's in the middle of the island. I'll be fine. We're laughing about this. This is very serious, though. There are insurance companies now that will no longer insure American cities on the coast unless they build up, dig down with stronger supports, or move back from the water, or a combination of all three. I have been involved in supporting a project in Lagos, Nigeria on Victoria Island, which juts out into the sea, which is building a 9-mile-long wall and recovering 10 million cubic meters of land. The Dutch have come to show how they design against floods to build this wall in a way that will take in enough water to keep the pressure off, but keep out enough to prevent flooding. This is a global phenomenon. It cannot be ignored. Meanwhile, in the Caribbean, you find, unbelievably, the highest electric rates in the world, on average. Your neighbors in the American Virgin Islands pay about 50 cents a kilowatt hour, quite a bit more than you do. Your neighbors in the Dominican Republic and Haiti pay between 35 and 40 cents a kilowatt hour, about what you do on the low side. Why is this? Because almost 100% of the energy of the Caribbean as a whole is generated by imported oil. Heavy, very much polluting, wildly expensive. In the Caribbean, only Trinidad and Tobago have the capacity to generate traditional oil and gas, and they sell the oil on the world market, set by a world price. So it's bad for the environment and debilitating to the economy. If you pay, which I think you do on average, let's say 34 cents a kilowatt hour for electricity In the United States, New York has the highest electricity at 13.9 cents a kilowatt hour. The lowest is, I think now, in Iowa at 5.8 cents. Iowa, South Dakota, and Texas regularly get 20% of their electricity from wind, and on a good day, 25% or more. The sun shines here and the wind blows, and people generate garbage as they do everywhere else, but there is very little sustained solar, wind, and solid waste energy development in the whole Caribbean. Where it has been done, it has been economically successful. My friend Rolando Gonzalez-Buncer is here. He just put up 90 megawatts of wind power in your neighbor in the Dominican Republic. He had to locate the site so far from the existing grid that he had to construct a 50-kilometer transmission system. The transmission line will be paid off in 2 years, after which he will be selling into the system from the wind with no subsidy at 15 cents a kilowatt hour, less than half what the country is paying. I got out this morning in San Juan and took a wonderful walk through the old city for 40 minutes, and I was reminded once again that the sun does shine here. And I know that some solar projects, as the governor was saying, have just been approved. And I am fairly familiar with how your utility is organized and what the reservations of all people who run utilities everywhere is, and shifting to solar and wind and basically losing some control over the supply. I get all that. But here's what I want you to think about. First, you clearly, in Puerto Rico, have a chance to lead the entire Caribbean in a move toward being energy independent. Second, you have a chance to set an example for the world in having an energy policy that allows economic growth and environmental responsibility. Third, you have a possibility of taking away the number one impediment to your future economic growth, which is high energy costs. You know, in my first term as governor, as president, when we were working through all of our budget problems, there was all this controversy about how the tax benefits to companies located in Puerto Rico were calculated. But they were all tied to trying to make the most of lower labor costs. The problem is now, particularly in all kinds of manufacturing, labor every year is a smaller percentage of overall cost, and materials, transportation, and energy are higher percentages. Whenever any economy has a cost that is glaringly out of line with its competitors, it is a severe constraint on growth. When I was supporting President Obama's attempts to reform healthcare last year, and healthcare is much more complicated than your energy situation here in Puerto Rico is. There are more moving parts, and there are more individual circumstances among the providers of healthcare and among the employers. But all the people who were attacking him, and then me, did it by talking about all the problems it would cause. They never once defended the status quo because they couldn't. Because the U.S. spends almost 18% of its income on health care, and none of our competitors spend more than 11.8%. And the difference is $1 trillion a year that could be put into new investments, new jobs, and rising incomes. So if I were planning Puerto Rico's economic future, And I wanted to keep the unemployment rate coming down as it has started to drop rather briskly. And I wanted to stop the out-migration of Puerto Ricans and encourage Puerto Ricans to come home. I would ask myself, what can I do to increase the economic growth rate here in a way that generates more good jobs and more opportunities? And the most obvious answer is to cut the cost of energy. Yes, it will be great politics if you lower the utility bills of people who are paying it now. That'll make them very happy. And yes, you won't be able to go as low as you could because your utility has some outstanding bond issues and they have to be able to collect enough money to meet their bond obligations. And yes, there is a pattern of employment and distribution, production and distribution of energy, which you don't want to change overnight because it's not fair to the people involved. But you cannot go on paying more than twice what every single person on the mainland of the United States is paying, and in some cases 4 and 5 times as much, and expect to be able to stop the population outflow, reverse it, bring your brightest young people home, and start growing a new economy. So to me, the climate change case is clear, not just for the world, for Puerto Rico as an island. The economic case is clear, and you have enough evidence already from the projects that have been started and from the projects you can see in the Dominican Republic or in Haiti, where the world's biggest, the Caribbean's biggest solar building has been built. A teaching hospital outside Port-au-Prince at Renovable, run by Partners in Health, now has 1,800 solar panels on it, which means they run the entire hospital 24 hours a day for 0 energy cost, and produced extra costs, extra energy, which they give to the utility to provide to the rest of the people in Haiti at lower cost. So what does all that mean? What should be done? First, I think there should be both a Puerto Rican strategy and a neighborhood strategy, and eventually a Caribbean strategy. And the ultimate goal should be to liberate you from any reliance on oil in the generation of your electricity. For the next 20 or 30 years, you can substitute liquefied natural gas in a way that is cheaper, lowers greenhouse gas emissions, and at least leaves you reliant on either your neighbors in the United States or your neighbors in Trinidad. Second, you should recognize that there has been a precipitous drop in the base cost of both wind and solar energy, and continued improvements in the technology for converting solid waste to energy, and you should try to accelerate the use of that. Today you have about 15% coal, and it's fairly high technology, what you've got here, and about 15% natural gas, and about 68% imported oil. In the short run, you can maximize the gas and try to replace everything else with solar, wind, solid waste, and greater efficiency. There are enormous efficiency opportunities that have not yet been claimed. Our foundation was fortunate to work in the United States on retrofitting the Empire State Building, probably the most famous non-government building in America, built in 1931. That one building kept 650 workers busy for 2.5 years on the retrofit. We cleared off the floor. We put in a glass factory. We replaced thousands of windows and all the heating and air conditioning and ventilation systems, and put up smart technology to cut off the lights and to change the heat depending on whether the rooms were being used, and cut the utility bill 40% when it's all implemented.
And all of this can be guaranteed by contractors or energy service providers who do this. We replaced our foundation working with the city of Los Angeles, 140,000 streetlights with LED streetlights. The streetlight electric bill dropped, and keep in mind it's a lot cheaper there than it is here, $10 million a year, just for the streetlights. Money that was freed up to reinvest in the city and deal with its challenges. I could give you lots of other examples. We work in a lot of cities in South America mostly on improving transportation, switching to government public transport to run on compressed natural gas or electricity. All these things are opportunities, but the big things that are staring you in the face here are the things that can be done with solar, wind, solid waste, and efficiency. And so I hope we can talk about some of the details. I know there are problems here. Nothing should be done which impairs the utility's obligation to pay off its bonded indebtedness. Nothing should be done to impair the creditworthiness of any entity in Puerto Rico because you want people to invest more here, not less. But if you cut the base level cost of energy and you keep the profit margin necessary to meet the bond obligations, you will still be ahead. One of the ways this is resolved in California, in the United States, is that instead of just contracting with independent companies like Energi, one of the companies that works here, they have a huge solar thermal operation on the border of California and Nevada. In Southern California, the utilities own the solar panels and they put them on all the buildings, cut the power bills of the people who own the buildings, the homes, the office buildings, and the universities are flooded with solar panels on their roofs. And then the utilities get the excess. But they own that just as if it were a power plant. So if they have 400,000 or 500,000 solar panels, it's just another power plant generating electricity from the sun. So there are ways to meet these challenges. But let's come back to the big picture. If you're worried about Puerto Rico losing population, if you want your young people to stay here and you want some of them who moved to Central Florida, where I was very glad they happened to be at the last election, but if you would like it if they came home, why in the world would you spend another 10 years with an economic strategy that hobbles you with one of the most important constituents that affect all investment decisions going forward in all kinds of new jobs? You can't do it, you shouldn't do it, it's not necessary. And it's really important for the future that we not waste these next few years in the battle against climate change. I don't think that we have more than 10 years or so to have a comprehensive strategy to prove we can grow the economy and reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. We know it can be done, but it requires all of us to change. And it's here it is kind of like the healthcare deal. I used to have a Secretary of Education when I was president named Dick Riley, whose favorite saying whenever I advocated anything was, remember my motto, let's change, you go first. The real challenge here is that any sustainable policy will have more moving parts than the current system. And people hate more moving parts. For example, you already have your power plants built. You have a utility company that contracts to buy oil. That's simple. You have however many suppliers you have who have oil. Then you take the oil and give it to the power plant and send the bills out. this will require some more moving parts and some creativity to keep the revenue flowing enough to meet the ongoing expenses of the company, including the bonded indebtedness. But if you don't do it, pretty soon they'll be in trouble anyway, as in some ways they already are, because you won't grow the economy as you should, and you'll have a shrinking population base, especially among the young, when they should be earning money, paying taxes, and paying their utility bills. But you will never find a time, at least in my lifetime, when making this transition is more affordable. Because the base electric rates in Puerto Rico and throughout the Caribbean are so high, switches to solar and wind, which require subsidies on the mainland of the United States, could be done in Puerto Rico and throughout the Caribbean with no subsidies whatever. And you still get to lower your electric bills and become much more open for the kind of businesses that I think you want to attract for the future, that are socially responsible, environmentally responsible, and have a good growth trajectory. So the few things our foundation has done here have been very rewarding. I am very grateful to the governor and his government and to the previous government for what they have done to try to put this issue beyond politics and make it good for Puerto Rico, good for the environment, good for the economy, good for the people. But you have just scratched the surface. And you could lead the whole Caribbean away from oil, away from the turbulence that climate change will be, to a more sustainable economy and a much more affordable one for the people who already live here, already work here, and could use a little lower utility bills to invest in other things which will generate more economic growth by far. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for a very revealing and profound message. Now we will proceed to a forum, and we would like to ask on stage Ms. Carmen Guerrero Perez, Secretary of the Puerto Rico Department of Natural and Environmental Resources. Thank you. And economist Sergio Marzuach, Director for Policy Development at the Center for the New Economy,
Mr. President, great to meet you.
and former Deputy Secretary of Commerce and Economic Development for the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico.
So, Mr. President, making sure that the microphone is working correctly. Well, Mr. President, again, thank you for a thought-provoking and an engaging proposal and presentation. You have brought to our attention some very interesting perspectives on the importance of how renewable energy will and can have for Puerto Rico's economy, quality of life, and sustainable future. For this discussion forum, as we prefer to see it as a conversation and a dialogue, we have a couple of questions and talking points that we would like to focus on the areas of Puerto Rico's energy policy, and then, if time allows us, we will talk of some of the challenges that energy policies is seeing at the international, at the United States level. Puerto Rico, as you mentioned, has no oil, no carbon, no natural gas. We have plenty of sun, wind, ocean, and organic material, yet we are almost 100% dependent on non-renewable energy sources. You've brought some specific strategies on how you think Puerto Rico should implement in order to achieve energy independence and be a leader on the Caribbean on renewable energies. We would also like to learn what opportunities do you see for the Caribbean, and specifically for Puerto Rico, in achieving economies of scale by promoting energy interconnectivity amongst our sister islands of the Dominican Republic, Haiti, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and the British Virgin Islands.
Well, first, I think you should be working on economies of scale because you can manage your load a lot better. It's one of the real problems with generating electricity everywhere is that if you rely too much on central power generation, then essentially you're saying that 90% of the time, 40% of the capacity you build will be vacant because we all have to build for what the needs will be at the hottest hour of the hottest day of the year when everybody is doing everything. The more you can spread that risk and take account of the variations, the better you can manage the load. I've been trying for years to get the Haitian and Dominican systems interconnected. Wouldn't cost very much to connect Puerto Rico with the Dominican Republic and with the Virgin Islands, for example. You have to, as I understand it, there's some issues in this part of the Caribbean about some interconnections because the cables can only be built so deep. But I think you could get that done. And I think it's worth doing if for no other reason that you might have an emergency someday or they might have an emergency and you all could spell it. But I think in general, you could more efficiently use your renewable resources as well as your non-renewable ones if you had some more economies of scale and you had interconnections, and it doesn't cost that much to do.
Thank you, Mr. President, for being with us here in Puerto Rico. My question is based actually on something you mentioned in your book, Back to Work, which was published in 2011. You mentioned there that in many U.S. states, ratepayers are stuck paying higher energy bills than they should, and I quote, thousands of jobs are left on the table due to ineffective or defective regulation and because, and I quote again, so few people understand the economics of energy. Can you share with us which incentives and regulatory structures do you think would facilitate the transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy, and what do you consider to be the best practices in this area?
Well, I think I can only tell you what I think works and what I've seen work. Anything you can do to bring energy efficiency into the orbit of your utility system itself as a strategy, in effect, of getting more power, not by building more plants or even importing more natural gas, but simply getting the existing users to use less and get the same outcome is a good thing. But what that means is that the utility has to see that as an opportunity, just as buying oil is an opportunity or building a new coal-fired power plant is an opportunity. So anything you can do to accelerate the retrofit of buildings is a good idea. The other thing I think is that I've seen work better in some places than others, and best in Southern California in the U.S., is if the utilities, instead of, well, let's say these solar projects you're approving now, 45 megawatts here, 50 there, these are really good things, and you should do them. But I also think it would be extremely good if you had the regulatory changes necessary to allow the utility to put up solar panels on like I drove around, first I walked around San Juan today for 40 minutes in the old city, and then I drove around a little coming here. You have an enormous number of flat roofs that are not gardens, right? You do. Every one of them should be covered in solar panels, and the utility can own them, so they don't have to resist saying, oh, I'm losing our sway, our span of control. And you rent the space by basically lowering or eliminating, if they generate enough power, the utility bill for the people who own the building below. Then if you generate excess, you take it into the system, but it's a part of the revenue stream of the utility itself. And in California they do that, and you can go to some of our colleges, like in Southern California, and you're surprised when you don't see every space on the roofs covered by solar now. Not when you do. It's worked out really well in the sense that the utility can integrate the solar capacity better into its overall demand management. And there, again, fewer moving parts. But you can then use rooftop solar to go along with the big solar investments or the big wind investments that you do elsewhere. Those are just two things. I think integrating both energy efficiency financing. For example, if the utility had an arm which would support the kind of thing that we did with your government complex here, that my climate change project worked on with you, for every building above X size, you name it, whatever it is, in the entire Ireland, it would facilitate the financing, and it would fill us. Then you could get an energy service company to come in here and guarantee all the savings for, let's say, 100 buildings instead of having to find 100 different people to guarantee the savings. And there are all kinds of systems that can be brought into play now. For example, I know a company in America that will come into the homes, ordinary homes, middle-sized homes of middle-class people, and spend 30 minutes to an hour and come out and say, okay, we will promise you that we can save you this much on your bill if you give us 8 hours. We only do 8-hour jobs. You pick the day, we'll show up, we'll fix your house. If we can't do it in 8 hours, we won't do it at all. There are all these options open up once you have a centralized way of financing it, which makes it work. There's simple software that does this, by the way. It's being done all over the country now. Little contractors are booming because they have the capacity they never had before. It's amazing. So that's what I think you ought to look at that. And I think you ought to just move more solar and wind. And if you have some waste to energy projects at landfills, I hope I live long enough to see every landfill in every major city in the world closed. Because they're enormous sources of methane, and they're eyesores and they're public health problems. And if you turn them into power generation by recycling the plastic, metal, glass, and organic material, which can be made into fertilizer for farmers, then all the rest can be turned into a power source. The two biggest landfills in Sao Paulo, Brazil, have now on-site power plants. So they will never grow in landmass now. They keep just feeding in the stuff that can't be recycled into the power source, and they produce clean power instead of just staying there as sources of pollution and public health standards. So those are the kinds of things that I think you ought to look at.
Thank you.
In the line of the rooftop solar panels that you just mentioned, there are a number of professors here from the University of Puerto Rico in Mayagüez who conducted a study that concluded that there are enough rooftops in the island, residential, commercial, and industrial, to meet all of our energy demands. Giving such a large rooftop resource and the limited land uses and land mass that we have here in Puerto Rico, and considering our goals of balancing renewable energy growth with the need to maintain sustainable land uses and development, would you recommend rooftops as the primary location for renewable energy, or would you recommend a balanced portfolio of rooftop systems, large or small, and utility scale projects?
Well, first of all, if you were starting from nothing, if we were just a blank slate, if there were no electricity in Puerto Rico and the buildings were up just as they are, and nobody had ever turned on an electric light, then I would probably recommend starting there and trying to do 100% of it that way. As a practical matter, you have all these other generators of electricity out there, all these other contracts underway. So there's a limit to how far you can go with that. But I'm not at all surprised that the study shows that. Again, I will say what you have to decide is, do you want to follow the Southern California model where the utility owns the panels and basically the people where the panels are that own those buildings get the benefit of them disproportionate, and the rest of it goes into the grid and benefits everybody? Or do you want to do it like Germany does, and most European countries, but Germany particularly, where in Germany and also in Denmark, the farmers in rural areas own their windmills, and the people who own the buildings own their own solar panels, and they get the economic benefit of it, and they help to finance it so they pay it off quicker, and then they sell the surplus to the utility. It looks to me like, based on what I have heard over the last 3 or 4 years from your political leaders and others, that it would be quicker, easier, and cause less turmoil is if the utilities themselves own the solar panels, but everybody had a right to put them up on their buildings. And so because then the utility, and from an accounting point of view, can look at it as moving out of this kind of power production into that kind. And even if their costs go way down, they can still have a price that will enable them to recover enough income to meet the bonded indebtedness and whatever other costs they have. And everybody will get cheaper power, and it'll be more reliable. And you'll get something else if you do that. If you decide to go to a rooftop system, you'll need so many of them, you can get some of these really good companies to come down and make them here. So you could, if you became the first place in the Caribbean to do this, you could also become a manufacturing center and supply most of the Caribbean with their solar panel needs. That you could do it. It's not that hard to do. You just have to figure out whose ox is being gored when you do it. And then figure out whether you're going to ungore the ox, that is, cut everybody in a way that, I don't mean this to sound bad, this is not, should all be totally transparent and open, but it preserves the current methods of distribution and pricing at a very much lower cost. Or you're going to create a whole new different way of distributing it. But again, keep in mind, human nature favors fewer moving parts. So, but you could do this either way.
Mr. President, following up on your suggestion about Puerto Rico becoming potentially a manufacturing site for green technology, the question that we have coming up is precisely, it's not only manufacturing, but also research and development of green energy technology is by itself a potential source of innovation, economic growth, and employment. In your opinion, what are the institutions and policies that Puerto Rico needs to put in place to become a center of innovation, not only at the manufacturing end, but in terms of doing the research and development, which is where the real value added is?
Well, I'll give you an example. Suppose you decided to do this rooftop thing. Suppose you decided to go all in on it and maximize your capacity. First thing you should do is have the university that did this study try to establish a partnership with one of the leading universities on the American mainland in solar power, probably Arizona State. The Chinese came and got them and built them a campus in China because they were so far advanced of most places. But you could then, if you made this kind of commitment, you could get serious investment to have a literally world-renowned research center here and all these energy technologies. I'll give you another example. As I understand it, the coal-fired plant capacity you have here is pretty efficient, more modern, not as polluting as some of the older coal-fired plants in America. But there's still this raging debate about whether we will ever be able to find a way to capture the carbon that comes from generating electricity from coal. The United States proper has had a big reduction in its greenhouse gases in 2 of the last 3 years, partly because we have been shifting out, closing coal plants, and using natural gas. And we've dropped our coal usage so much that coal got so cheap that now they're exporting American coal all the way to South America to burn in plants. But still, in Europe and in Asia, there's a lot of reliance on coal because they don't want to go to nuclear, and they can't figure out how to generate all their electricity from the sun and the wind, which you could do. They don't have the same capacity you do, and we could do in America. In the continental America, there's a study that George W. Bush's Energy Department did that said enough wind blows from the Canadian border with North Dakota to Mexico's border with South Texas to electrify America many times over, but we don't have the transmission system to carry the power from where the wind is to where the people are. But anyway, all this is out here. If I were you, I would, if you made this commitment, I would have a simultaneous commitment to build a world-class university research center here on emerging solar technologies, emerging tidal technologies. You know, the only place now that I'm aware of where people believe there's truly economic turbine potential in ocean currents, which is what you were mentioning earlier, is in the Indian Ocean between Perth, Australia, and India, where the currents are particularly strong, and in Hawaii. But there are small turbines in the East River in New York City that are sort of demonstration, like they're not very big. In other words, the technology options for improvement here are rather dramatic. And if I were you, I wouldn't concentrate on anyone. I'd start with solar if you were going to make the big hit here. But I think you could become first the manufacturer of choice for solar panels in the Caribbean, and then the research center for a clean energy future, maybe one of the most prominent ones in the world, but you have to start somewhere, so that's where I would start.
Now, in regards to climate change vulnerability and adaptation, our principal energy infrastructure is currently located within our coastline in areas highly vulnerable to sea level rise and other climate change impacts and threats. Puerto Rico's Power Authority is investing in converting our power plants from burning oil to natural gas as a transition strategy. We must adapt to climate change, but adaptation is definitely costly. How do you envision small islands affording the investment necessary to adapt to climate change? And what policy recommendations could you provide to our government in terms of climate change vulnerability, reduction, and adaptability?
Well, first of all, I think you need a resilience plan. And probably one that would unfold over 20 years. That is, there are reasonably good climate models which predict how much the sea levels are likely to rise in the Caribbean, and how that, combined with the flow of the Gulf Stream and other variables, is likely to affect all the islands here. I think that first you need to know, is the fact that San Juan is in a bay sufficient protection? If not, what else do you need to do? Do you need to reinforce the buildings? Do you need to reinforce the structure under the buildings? Do you need a whole different building code for buildings that will be built in the future if your tourism business keeps booming and more building occurs on the water anywhere in Puerto Rico? Do you have the right building codes? I'll never forget when I was down with the first President Bush in the Houston area, the Galveston area a few years ago after Hurricane Ike hit. There was only literally a mile-long stretch on the beach. There was one house completely undamaged. All the others were totally wrecked. And it had been built according to FEMA's new anti-hurricane standards about 3 years after all these other houses were built. And literally, there it was, all alone. When I went out to the Rockaways in New York City after Sandy hit, you could walk up and down the beach and you could see the homes that had been built according to the anti-hurricane, anti-flooding standards, and they were all there, and the others were wrecked. This is not a complicated thing. Every island nation needs a resilience plan, and you should engage insofar as you have widespread involvement with insurance companies, you should get them to come help you, because the insurance companies have become the biggest advocates of doing something about climate change, because otherwise they're going to go broke. Or they're going to be able not to provide insurance. But I think that's the most important thing. And I think, in other words, you have to prepare for the worst. Do you want to have more buffers? You want to construct barrier islands? What do you need to do here? You just need a plan for it. But I'll give you another example. When the Maldives, remember when the tsunami hit South Asia at the end of 2004? And Southeast India was hurt badly, and parts of Thailand. But the major damage was to Aceh in Indonesia and the Maldives, which lost, a tiny little island nation, which lost 64% of its GDP for a year. But the capital city of the Maldives was basically untouched, because the Japanese government had come in there years before and built them a storm wall, which basically, and the tsunami got over it, but not at flood stage, not in a way that could bury the city. And they dried themselves off, cleaned themselves up, and then went to work putting the country back together. But these protections work. There are lots of Dutch companies, because of the massive work they started doing more than 60 years ago now in the Netherlands. There are Dutch companies that do this for a living that could be brought into not just Puerto Rico, but a Caribbean-wide effort to build resilience. But I would do it if I were in charge of this kind of work around anywhere in the Caribbean. I would do it. I would have a resilience plan.
The governor recently signed an executive order ordering all the different agencies, principal agencies that have infrastructure, to develop a vulnerability assessment and resilience plan.
You might have some popular discontent with the cost of it in the beginning, but if you explain to people what the difference is, and you could actually show, you could put ads in the newspaper, you could put information on television, which would show these places that have been hit by storms, and those where they did the right resistance and resilience, and those where you didn't. It's just dramatic. It would take your breath away to see. And it's not very much fun picking up the pieces when a place is wrecked. And it's far more expensive to do that than to spend less money on the front end protecting from the worst consequences of it. And I don't think you can stop some of this ocean rising. So this is probably something we need to do regardless, no matter what happens, even if the world hasn't total brain change tomorrow and decides to maximize, do all this stuff I think should be done and then some, we're still going to have some of this disruption, so it needs to be done.
Mr. President, thinking now about federal policy in terms of what can be done from Congress, do you think Congress should develop an energy policy for U.S. offshore jurisdictions that factors in the unequal costs borne by the islands due to the fact that they're not interconnected as the European Union does for its offshore jurisdictions?
Yeah, because they're islands. And not just here, but in Guam, for example. Mm-hmm. I feel very strongly that we should have a federal policy on it. But I believe that the United States has not only a special obligation to Puerto Rico and to the Virgin Islands, but we have an obligation to all of our neighbors in the Caribbean. Like I said, they're our trading partners. We have, trade preferences here. And yet, none of these places can take full advantage of it because of the extraordinary price they're paying for electricity. We have spent an enormous amount of money trying to help Haiti rebuild. And I worked there for 4 years as the UN envoy, and I'm still helping them with investment strategies. But I can tell you, I'd be 50% more successful if they paid 18 cents a kilowatt hour for electricity instead of 36. This is, it's absolutely, and even more so than you, because you've upgraded your labor force and skill level. They still are looking for a lot of labor-intensive, low-skilled jobs that, by and large, have moved out of Puerto Rico. So yes, the short answer is yes, we should do it. We should help our island nations develop resilience plans. We should help them to deal with this before it happens. But we have a special obligation in the Caribbean. And we also have a lot of people who get this in our neighborhood. If you look at Central America, which has also been devastated by tornadoes several times in recent years, Costa Rica has a per capita income that is twice the Central American average. They have 92% of their electricity comes from hydropower. They will soon have 100% clean electricity because of they have extraordinary potential from geothermal because they have dormant but rumbling volcanoes. And I was down there not very long ago to speak at a sustainability conference, and I went to see the president of Costa Rica. And by the way, they have 26% of their land in national forest, 51% is forest covered, up from 41% 10 years ago. The governor is, in American parlance, probably a moderate Republican. She was in the center-right party. So she said, they tell me we have oil off the coast of Costa Rica, but we have no intention of finding out. This is the conservative. I thought, I wonder if I could get her in the U.S. Congress. And so I said, why, Madam President? She said, it's not our brand. We do $2 billion a year in ecotourism. When our low-level city dwellers approved an increase in their water rates to send to farmers in the uplands to plant more trees to preserve the balance of the ecostructure. And we'll soon be at 100% clean electricity generation. I said, well, is there anything I can do for you? She said, yeah, we still spend $1 billion a year on imported oil to run our cars. Get me an electric car company here. I will buy every single car you can produce until every Costa Rican is in one. We have a clinic and a school in every village. I'll put your recharging stations in. And when we're all bought up, you can export them to Mexico and the U.S. with no duty. My point is they've had a mind change, right? They're thinking in a different way. She still thinks she's a conservative. She's for lower taxes than the people who run against her. She's for more limited government than the people that run against her. But their model of how the country should work is in a whole different place. So, and that's the way I feel about all this resilience stuff. This is going to happen, no matter what we do on climate change. But right now, the risks are manageable if you prepare against them. So I'm glad you got a plan to do it.
Well, Mr. President, on behalf of the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, I thank you for a productive dialogue. Also, thank you to Sergio Marzuach. Your perspectives and insights will definitely help us out in our administration's role.
Thank you very much.
Very helpful. Thank you. Thank you.